Anyway, here we go. First of all, Erev Yom HaZikaron, and it's appropriate to remember the Oleh Gardon, those fighters of the Etzel, but it was also the Lechi that were hung by the British prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. The first one was Shlomo ben Yosef. He was only 25 when he was involved in a terrorist attack, whatever you want to call it. He was involved in an attack on a bus in 1938. Actually, no one was killed. And the two people who were with him, one got off on the basis of the fact that he claimed insanity. The other one was not hung by the British because he was underage. Shlomo ben Yosef, at the age of 25, was hung and is buried in the cemetery in Rosh Pina. The two people underneath, the two Etzel fighters, Eliyahu Hakim and Eliyahu Ben Suri, I think actually they're probably Lechi fighters, and they were involved in a successful assassination attempt on the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Lord Moyne, who was assassinated in 1945, actually before the World War II ended. And Lord Moyne, by the way, was, for those of us that come from London, was actually cremated in Golders Green Crematorium after the event. But both Hakim and Bet Suri were hung by the British in Egypt. Elachi, Kashani, and Dresdner were involved in an attack on a bank in Jaffa. They were hung, and Dov Gruner, he was involved in an attack on a British police station, and he was also hung by the British. By the way, they were all hung in the prison in Akko. Feinstein and Barzani, I mentioned in one of my previous talks. They were imprisoned. One, I think, I don't remember which way round it was. One of them was from Lechi, one was from Etzel. They were imprisoned in the Russian compound in Jerusalem, and they planned to blow themselves up with the hangman. But on understanding that the rabbi of the prison would also be there, they blew themselves up in their cell. They put a grenade next to their hearts, and they blew themselves up. And they should all be remembered by us, and Chaviv, Weiss, and Naka will talk about in the next few minutes. Okay, so in April of 1947, the main British prison was in Akko. It can be visited today, and it has a very nice audio-visual presentation around the prison that recreates the events of 1947. At that time, there were 163 Jews incarcerated, 87 of which were on terrorist charges. Most of them were Etzel fighters. There were some Lechi, and there was, I think, 5 members of the Haganah, and there were also 400 Arabs. And at that time, so in April, the 3 Gruner, as we saw before, Elachi, Kashani, and Dresdner and Gruner were all on death row, and they were executed, I think, in the middle of April. But what changed things around was an Arab worker that reportedly heard women's voices. He was involved in the storage of oil for the kitchen, and he heard women's voices, which couldn't be because there were only men in the prison. He reported this to Eitan Livni, or Eitan Livni got to hear about it, and he in turn, Eitan Livni was the senior Etzel prisoner in the prison. He passed it on to Amichai Paglin, known as Giddy. These the fighters, they all had code names. And Giddy did a sivuv around Akko, and he understood that the voices must have been coming from the Turkish Spar, or the Hammam, that was located adjacent in the old city, adjacent to Akko prison. And he devised a plan, which came too late for the 4 prisoners that were on death row, but they devised a plan to get out, to release from the prison 41 prisoners, 30 members of the Etzel and 11 Lechi. In order to do this, they did something which sounds something like out of a John le Carre novel. They smuggled explosives into the prison in big jam drums, And apparently the drums were opened by the British. The Sergeant Major put his stick into the jam container and he felt something solid, which were the explosives. But it was explained away by saying that the jam hadn't set properly, and somehow the British believed that. The detonators and fuses were smuggled in also in oil drums, and in this case the British didn't find the false bottoms that were on the bottom of the containers. The prison break was set for the 4th of May. The planning for the prison break was done in Netanya, in a deserted diamond factory in the industrial area, and the Etzel fighters trained in Shuni, which is located just outside Binyamina, and can be visited to this day. And on the 4th of May, 4 trucks left. 2 were disguised as British Army trucks, and they contained in them 20 Etzel fighters with forged or with make-up British uniforms. There were also 2 trucks, 2 civilian trucks, which they hoped they would use to transport the escapees away from the prison. And 3 of the Etzel fighters also dressed up as Arabs. The overall command of the operation to break into the prison was under Dov Cohen. He was known as Shimshon. And they traveled up to Akko. And the troops, the 2 groups of British soldiers, or they weren't really British soldiers, they were Etzel fighters disguised as British soldiers, stormed into the Hammam and went out the other side of the Hammam and placed the explosive charges on the prison walls. At the same time, at 3 p.m., the prisoners, you can see in the picture at the bottom, the prisoners, most of the prisoners went out into the courtyard of the prison to conduct their daily exercise. The prisoners who were designated, the 41 prisoners that were designated to escape, stayed in their cells. At 4:22 p.m. on the 4th of May, there was a massive explosion, and the 41 escapees came out of their cells. They weren't locked at the time, and they used the explosives that had been smuggled into the jail to blast their way through 3 metal grates, or 3 metal grills, and make their way towards the kitchen. Here you can see the hole in the walls that were made, in the holes in the prison that were made by the explosives that were laid by the Etzel. The prisoners that escaped, the first thing that happened, so 16 escaping prisoners were put on a truck and were driven away from the prison. Unfortunately, the truck driver went the wrong way. He went towards Haifa, which was the main British contingent was there, and a number of British soldiers that were actually on the beach, they were alerted, or they saw the truck, they fired on the truck overturned, and 5 of the escapees were killed, 6 were injured, and only 2 were unscathed. Also, there were other problems as well. There were 2 blocking groups, 2 groups of fighters that were dropped off in Akko, and despite putting up a fight, they were eventually captured. And here are the names of the 5 fighters that were captured, and we'll meet 3 of them afterwards. The remaining escapees were loaded into trucks, and they managed, together with the fighters, to reach the base of Binyamina and Shuni. And Chaim Applebaum, who was I think he was a Lehi escapee. I don't remember if he was an escapee or one of the fighters. I think he was an escapee. He unfortunately died of his wounds on the way to Binyamina. Okay, so to summarize the whole operation, they tried to get 41 prisoners out, but the Etzel only managed to break out 20 Etzel fighters and 7 Lehi fighters. There were 6 escapees and 3 fighters that were killed outside the prison. Another 8 escapees and 5 fighters were captured by the British. These 5 fighters that are mentioned here, and the whole action was described by the two politicians on the right-hand side, who's clearly Begin and Ben-Gurion. One described it as an act of heroism, and the other one described it as a suicide act. And it should be pretty obvious to you which one described it as which. So of the 5 fighters that were captured, Avshalom, Chaviv, Meir, Naka, Yaakov, Weiss were sentenced to be hung by the British. The other 2 fighters were, they certainly weren't let off. I think they got life, or they were sentenced to life imprisonment, and I don't remember why. But anyway, these three were sentenced to hanging, and on the basis of the fact that 9 fighters, Lechi, Etzel, had already been hung, the Etzel were in no doubt that the British would carry it out. And what the Etzel decided to do was, they came up with a plan, which is that they would try to abduct British senior officials, soldiers, policemen, and to try to negotiate some kind of exchange whereby Chaviv, Nakar, and Weiss would be released. On June 22nd, they attempted to capture Assistant Superintendent CJC Pound in Jerusalem. They didn't succeed. And on the 24th of June, they also in Jerusalem tried to abduct a senior administrative officer, Alan Major. The British became very aware of the fact that they were subject for abductions. And they basically told all their soldiers, the soldiers were not allowed to go out of base alone. And there were curfew hours by which British soldiers had to be back in base, and they couldn't go out late at night. And so to the story that connects up to Netanya. Aaron Weinberg was obviously a Jew. He was employed by the British. He worked in the British camps that were surrounding Netanya. He was also a source of information, mainly for the Haganah. And he let the Haganah know, and it became known to the Etzel as well, that there were 2 British sergeants, Marvin Pace and Clifford Martin, that would go out, just the 2 of them, in contravening British regulations, would stay out late at night, and also they would be out in plain clothes. And the Etzel devised a plan to abduct these 2 British sergeants. For this, in order not to arouse suspicion, they used Yosef Meller, who was a taxi driver, and he had a black cab, and his cab was known in Netanya. And it was thought that if he had people in his cab late at night, it would not arouse suspicion. On the 11th of July, late at night, the 2 sergeants went out. They went to a bar on the beach, and they actually met there Weinberg. And on the way back after midnight, the sergeants were abducted. Weinberg was taken to an orchard where he was let go. The sergeants were bundled into Yosef Meller's taxi, and they were taken to the industrial area of Netanya. There, they were hidden in an underground chamber that was underneath the abandoned Netanya diamond polishing factory that we mentioned previously. Now, there were various stages where the Haganah acted, or the Yishuv, Ben-Gurion, the Haganah acted against both Etzel and Lechi, and this was one of those occasions. Basically, the Haganah assisted the British in searching for the 2 sergeants. And Ben-Gurion was quite torn by this. In one way, he was against the Etzel and the Lechi doing whatever they wanted, against possible a situation of anarchy. But at the same time, he basically looked for information and passed that information on to the British. And what the Haganah leaders wanted to do was that the British would find the sergeants, and it wouldn't be the Haganah that would find them. On the 13th of July, the British launched Operation Tiger, which essentially closed down Netanya, and they went on an intensive search. At the same time, the Haganah were on one of their Saison operations, whereby they were acting against the Etzel and the Lechi. In fact, the factory where the 2 sergeants were held was searched twice by the British, And they even interviewed, I don't think they interrogated the janitor or the manager of the factory, but he was unaware of what was going on underneath the factory. By the way, the sergeants must have been kept in absolutely terrible conditions. They were initially, chloroform was used to sedate them. And I think when they were put in the chamber, there was oxygen there for them to breathe, and they were provided with food. Food was down there so that they could stay down there for a long time. And indeed, they were down there for a long time. They were down there for, as I said, they were abducted at the start of July. They were down there for almost the whole of July. The British, though, would not be in any way deterred from carrying out the hangings. And on the 29th of July, 1947, Chaviv, Weiss, and Naka met death. And what happened was described by an Etzel prisoner named Chaim Wasserman in a letter that he wrote to Menachem Begin, and this is what he wrote. Towards evening, a party of hangmen arrived. The officers went in and informed the condemned men they were to be executed between 4 and 5 in the morning. Their reply was to sing Hatikva. At 2, Rabbi Nissam Ohana was brought and stayed in the cell 15 minutes, the cell being they were all kept together on death row. At 4 in the morning, Avshalom began singing Hatikva, and we joined in loudly, pressing against the bars. At once, armed police came to the visitors' fence near our cell. At 4:03, Avshalom was hanged. None of them, they all started the Hatikva. None of them managed to complete the words of the Hatikva, as the hangman's noose was around their necks and the trapdoor opened beneath their feet. At 4:25, we were shaken by the powerful singing of Meir. Hardly able to breathe, we nevertheless joined in. He was hanged at 4:28. At 5 o'clock, the voice of Yaakov, this time alone, penetrated our cell singing Hatikva. Again, we joined in. 2 minutes later, he was hanged. The next day, we declared a fast and prayed. Later in the morning, we found the following inscription on the wall of the cell of the condemned. They will not frighten the Hebrew youth in the homeland with their hangings. Thousands will follow in our footsteps. Next to it was the Irgun insignia and the 3 names of the men who were executed. Okay, so the Etzel, on the same day, on the 29th of July at 6 p.m. after the 3 members of the Etzel were hanged in Akko, they hung the 2 sergeants in the diamond factory in Netanya. The sergeants apparently asked to write a note to their families, and they were denied this. On the next morning, the 9 a.m. in the morning, the bodies were moved, again by taxi, not the same taxi. The bodies were moved in daylight to the eucalyptus grove in East Netanya that we who live in Kiryat HaSharon know so well. And underneath the trap was a booby trap was placed also to ambush the British. A note that was pinned to the tree said this. It said that the 2 British sergeants were tried after the completion of the investigations of their criminal anti-Hebrew activities. And they were tried on the following: illegal entry into the Hebrew homeland, membership of the British criminal terrorist organization known as the Army of Occupation, illegal possession of arms, anti-Jewish spying in civilian clothing, premeditated hostile designs against the underground. Found guilty of these charges, they've been sentenced to hang, and their appeal for clemency dismissed. And I just want to play you now a newsreel which shows how the news was received in Britain.
Room with some of his fellow officers. All decent people must have been horrified by the murder by Jewish terrorists of the 2 British sergeants, Mervyn Pace and Clifford Martin. Their funeral took place at the Ramley Cemetery with full military honours. The 2 sergeants, kidnapped as hostages, were hanged as a reprisal, the sort of cruelty once commonly indulged in by the Nazis. Until the appalling situation in Palestine is cleared up, unspeakable outrages may well continue.
Okay, a interesting reference to the Nazis in that newsreel. So I think for many years, the forest that everyone called here Parca Sargentum, or the Sergeant's Forest, it was never officially marked as the Sergeant's Forest, perhaps to some way cover up the events, the hanging of the British two British sergeants, which you can argue may have been necessary, but maybe is not our proudest moment. Just a few months ago, I noticed now there is actually one sign which shows the reference to the sergeants. This is directly opposite the college gym, and it says Hachosha, and the word sergeants in brackets though. Maybe the brackets indicate that we maybe not so proud of killing the sergeants, and perhaps we should concentrate particularly on this evening of remembering the fighters of the Etzel and the Lechi.